video, we're going to cover the menstrual cycle, specifically the uterine cycle, which describes the changes that occur to the endometrium, the uterine lining during the menstrual cycle. We're going to break down the structure of the uterus, the phases of the uterine cycle, and the factors that control ovarian function. If you haven't seen the previous lecture on ovulation, go ahead and watch that first and then come back to this one because everything connects. So pause this video first and then go watch that lecture and then come back to this one. Okay, so let's begin this lecture by breaking down the structure of the uterus because we're focusing on the events that's happening here. Let's label the other structures of the internal female genitalia as well. So there's the vagina, a muscular tube, the cervix, which is the lower part of the uterus, and then the fallopian tubes, which are J-shaped structures, the ovaries, and the uterus. So the uterus has three parts. There's the fundus, which is the top of the uterus, the body, this is where implantation usually occurs, and the cervix, the lower portion. Now, the uterus is composed of three layers, three tissue layers. There's the peritoneum or perimetrium, which is the outer layer of the uterus. It's a double-layered membrane. Then the myometrium, which is a thick, smooth muscle layer. It's the middle layer of the uterus and it's also the thickest. The myometrium plays an important role during childbirth and also contracts during menstruation. And then there's the endometrium, which is the inner mucous membrane lining of the uterus. So during the menstrual cycle, the endometrium grows to a thick lining filled with blood vessels to prepare for a possible implantation, possible fertilization. It's like each month the uterus is preparing for a guest that may or may not even come. It lays out nice and fluffy blankets and paints the wall, and it's the most optimistic part of the body, right? So let's zoom into the uterus and take a closer look at its structure. Okay, oh, look at this beauty. So this here is the perimetrium. Then there's the myometrium, the thick, smooth muscle layer that's involved in childbirth and also contracts during menstruation, and the endometrium. And the endometrium can be subdivided into two parts. There's the deep stratum basalis, the basal layer, and the stratum functionalis. So the stratum functionalis, the functional and superficial layer. This is the part of the endometrium that sheds off during menstruation. It's the source of menstrual flow. This here, okay, is the epithelium lining and the uterine gland, which is a secreting gland. There are two types of arteries supplying the endometrium. The stratum basalis have short and straight arteries, and the stratum functionalis, the functional and superficial layer, have spiral and coiled arteries. Our main focus in this lecture is to break down the several changes that occur to the endometrium during the menstrual cycle. And this depends on the hormonal changes that occur during the menstrual cycle. So recall in the previous lecture, we covered how the hormone concentration changes during the cycle, during the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. And so similar to the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle can also be divided into three phases. There's the menstrual phase or menstruation, the proliferative phase, this is during the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, and the last phase is the secretory phase, which occurs during the luteal phase. So now let's subtract complexity and break down the menstrual phase. Okay. In the ovulation lecture, we covered the ovarian phases, how follicles develop and mature, and how the corpus luteum develops. Now, we're going to come back to this diagram here, when we tie everything together. But now let's break down what happens to the endometrium during the menstrual cycle. I want more space to break this down to simplify it. Okay? So the menstrual cycle lasts approximately 28 days, and day 1 is the first day of the cycle. This is when bleeding starts. It's the first day of menstruation. And the entire bleeding stage is known as the menstrual phase. And menstruation differs between individuals, but generally lasts about 3 to 5 days. During this time, the endometrium, the epithelial lining of the uterus degenerates, and this is the source of the menstrual flow. The superficial layer, the stratum functionalis, is the part of the endometrium that sheds off. So how does this work? Let's break this down. The changes that occur to the uterine lining are caused by the changes in estrogen and progesterone concentration. So referring back to the previous lecture, estrogen and progesterone are secreted by the ovaries. Let's bring back the graph from the previous lecture and show this. After ovulation, when the egg is released, the secondary oocyte, the remaining follicle in the ovary, the granular cells, turns into the corpus luteum. This is the start of the luteal phase. The corpus luteum secretes large amounts of progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin. Now, progesterone levels are high during the luteal phase because progesterone plays an important role in making sure the endometrium is ready for implantation of a blastocyst. And when the egg that is ovulated is not fertilized, the corpus luteum degenerates because we don't need it, okay? The corpus luteum supports early pregnancy before the placenta takes over. So when the egg is not fertilized, the guest is not coming, then the corpus luteum degenerates. And this is the end of the luteal phase. And when the corpus luteum degenerates, again, the plasma concentration of progesterone and estrogen decreases. And so the endometrium is deprived of hormonal support. And what happens when the endometrium is deprived of its hormonal support? The endometrium, starts secreting prostaglandins when the concentration of progesterone and estrogen decreases. And this leads to the spiral arteries that supply the stratum functionalis and the uterine smooth muscle layer to start contracting. And the uterine blood vessels constrict, where we're going to be reducing blood flow and nutrients to the cell. And this is the major source of menstrual cramps or dysmenorrhea, because there's an overproduction of these prostaglandins which cause uterine contractions. And prostaglandins also affect other smooth muscle in the body, which is why during menstruation, an individual may also experience headache, nausea, or vomiting. I think of it as like the hormones in endometrium spend so much time preparing the guest house, preparing for a possible implantation, a pregnancy, for a guest that may or may not even come. But then after a while, the corpus luteum is like, well, the guest isn't coming, so why am I giving out hormonal support? Why am I giving estrogen and progesterone to the endometrium to house a guest that's not even coming? And so it decreases its hormonal support. It takes it away. It decreases progesterone and estrogen secretion. And it's taking away the hormonal support for the endometrium. And when that happens, prostaglandins just comes out and gets angry that a guest isn't implanting, and so it mediates vasoconstriction of the arteries, the uterine blood vessels, and causes uterine contractions. So the blood vessels are constricting and we're reducing blood flow and nutrients. And it's so angry that it decides to also affect other smooth muscle elsewhere in the body, which is why an individual may also experience headaches, nausea, and vomiting. So vasoconstriction of the blood vessels leads to necrosis of the endometrium. And the functional layer of the endometrium and walls of the capillaries rupture. And so after it contracts, blood comes from the damaged capillaries, and along with the necrosed epithelial cells are the source of menstrual flow. So menstrual flow is blood mixed with necrosed endometrium. Now the blood of the menstrual flow doesn't clot because there are proteolytic enzymes that destroy the proteins needed for coagulation of the blood, and that is how blood clotting is avoided. And going back to the other layer of the endometrium, the basal layer, the stratum basalis, it remains unaffected because it's supplied by straight arteries. And so the functional layer is the only layer that is lost because it's supplied by spiral and coiled arteries. So that's the menstrual phase, usually days 1 to 5. Let's now move on to the next phase, and that is the proliferative phase. This is the phase which corresponds to the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. This is where the endometrium is regenerated. This is from day 5 to day 15 of the cycle, of the menstrual cycle. The endometrium, the cells of the basal layer proliferates. It rapidly divides to regenerate the functional layer and the spiral arteries. It's going to be increasing its thickness, and the uterine glands are straight and long, and they are widely separated. So at this stage, the myometrium also grows, the uterine smooth muscle layer. So let's talk about what stimulates this phase. During menstruation, the body begins to prepare to release an oocyte again, ovulation. And so multiple follicles begin to develop during the follicular phase. The hypothalamus secretes GnRH, which triggers the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. And secretion of these hormones stimulate follicular growth. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, it's in the name, okay? And as the follicles grow, granulosa cells start multiplying and dividing, and these cells start secreting estrogen. But remember that the theca cells help estrogen production by synthesizing androgens, and the androgens diffuse into the granulosa cells to stimulate estrogen production. Okay, and when the plasma concentration of estrogen increases, it stimulates endometrium growth, triggers endometrium proliferation and vascularization. It also triggers the synthesis of progesterone receptors in the endometrial cells because we're nearing ovulation. We're preparing for a guest here, okay? Then prior to ovulation, there's an LH surge, and the Graafian follicle ruptures and releases an oocyte, a secondary oocyte from the ovary. And after ovulation, it's the next uterine phase, which is the secretory phase. But before we move on to the secretory phase, let's quickly recap what we've just covered. There's a lot to cover here. So, quick recap, the menstrual cycle lasts approximately 28 days, and day 1 is the first day of menstruation. This is when bleeding starts, menstrual flow. And this lasts usually 3 to 5 days depending on the individual. It differs between individuals, and this marks a new cycle. This stage is also known as the menstrual phase. Menstruation is triggered by the degeneration of the corpus luteum, because the corpus luteum secretes progesterone and estrogen, which supplies the endometrium with hormonal support. And so when implantation and fertilization doesn't happen, the corpus luteum degrades and the endometrium is deprived of support. This leads to vasoconstriction of the blood vessels and necrosis of the functional layer. So the walls of the capillaries ruptures and menstruation begins. The corpus luteum is what supports early pregnancy, and it prepares the endometrium for a possible pregnancy, for a possible guest. And so if that guest doesn't come and fertilization and implantation doesn't happen, the corpus luteum degenerates and it deprives the endometrium of hormonal support, of estrogen and progesterone support. Then from day 5 to day 15, this is the second uterine phase, known as the proliferative phase. This phase corresponds to the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. So the follicular phase, where follicles are growing, okay, the granulosa cells are multiplying and dividing, and so what's happening in the endometrium is we're regenerating the functional layer again and all the arteries with it. At the start of a new cycle, multiple follicles start to develop as a result of FSH and LH secretions. And as the follicles grow, the granulosa cells start secreting estrogen. And estrogen stimulates endometrium growth and proliferation. So the endometrium starts getting thick again, preparing the house. Then day 14 to 15, ovulation occurs. We're going to be releasing the secondary oocyte from the ovary. And this is the start of the third uterine phase, known as the secretory phase. So let's break that down. The secretory phase is from day 15 to 28 of the cycle, and this corresponds to the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. At this stage, the endometrium is preparing for the potential implantation of an embryo. It's waiting for a guest to come through and stay. And during this phase, the corpus luteum develops and produces large amounts of progesterone. And progesterone transforms the endometrium to an actively secreting tissue. So the endometrial is rich with blood vessels, and the endometrial glands become coiled and spiral, kind of like a corkscrew shape. and it's filled with glycogen. Enzymes also build up in the glands and connective tissue. Why? Why is this happening? Because it's preparing the house for a guest that may or may not even come. It's preparing for implantation and to provide nourishment for the growing embryo. So the endometrium is thick and loaded with water, and the spiral arteries are stimulated to supply a possible placenta. And so if implantation of a blastocyst occurs, then the secretory lining remains as the decidua, the specialized mucosal lining of the uterus that becomes part of the placenta. It provides support and protection for the growing embryo during gestation. And another important thing that progesterone does is it inhibits muscle contraction of the myometrium, the thick muscle layer. And this is to make sure that the fertilized egg can implant and also to prevent premature delivery. Now, progesterone and estrogen also plays a role in mucus secretion by the cervix. What happens is when it's just the estrogen present, the mucus in the cervix is clear and watery so that the sperm can move through the mucus to the uterus and fallopian tubes. However, when progesterone concentration is high, and this is after ovulation, the mucus secreted by the cervix becomes thick and sticky, and it creates this mucus plug. This is to prevent bacteria from entering the uterus, because if the egg that is ovulated is fertilized, the embryo needs to be protected. And on the other hand, if implantation doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum degenerates, which causes progesterone and estrogen levels to decrease. And like we've mentioned, what happens when the endometrium is deprived of hormonal support of estrogen and progesterone? Well, the events that we talked about during the menstrual phase, vasoconstriction of blood vessels, arteries that support the functional layer ruptures, and the epithelial lining sheds. And this is the source of menstrual flow, blood and epithelial cells, and there are enzymes that destroy coagulation factors to avoid blood clotting. And we begin a new cycle as estrogen and progesterone levels drop, FSH and LH secretions increases, triggering the development of new follicles. And so that is the secretory phase. Before we end this lecture, let's combine the uterine cycle with the ovarian cycle and take a look at the overview process of the menstrual cycle and how both of these phases, the ovarian cycle and uterine cycle, matches and lines up together. Let's quickly recap what we've covered. So, day 1 of menstrual flow marks the first day of the menstrual cycle. This is when bleeding starts, and this lasts usually 3 to 5 days. This is caused by the degeneration of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone and estrogen, and when fertilization doesn't occur, it degenerates, leading to the loss of the functional layer of the endometrium. The spiral and coiled arteries ruptures, which is the source of menstrual flow, along with endometrial debris. From day 5 to day 15 is the second uterine phase, known as the proliferative phase, which corresponds to the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. At this phase, follicles start to grow and develop, and they secrete estrogen, and estrogen stimulates endometrial growth. And day 14 to 15, ovulation occurs, the mature follicle ruptures and releases a secondary oocyte. Then day 15 to day 28, this is the third uterine phase, known as the secretory phase. The corpus luteum develops and secretes large amounts of progesterone and estrogen to the uterus for a possible implantation, a guest that may or may not come. The mucus secreted by the cervix becomes thick and sticky, creating a plug to protect the uterus from bacteria. But if implantation doesn't occur and the egg doesn't get fertilized, the corpus luteum degrades. Progesterone and estrogen concentration drops significantly, and the endometrium secretes prostaglandins, which causes constriction of blood vessels and contractions of the myometriums. This explains cramping during menstruation. The functional layer disintegrates and menstruation occurs, and the menstrual phase begins again, marking the beginning of a new cycle. Wow, what a process just to prepare for a potential guest. The uterus is just such an optimistic part, right? So that is the uterine events that occur during the menstrual cycle, also referred to as the uterine cycle, describing the changes that occur to the endometrium during the cycle. That is the uterine cycle. In this lecture, we learned that the uterine cycle describes the changes that occur to the endometrium during the menstrual cycle. We broke down the structure of the uterus and how it's composed of 3 tissue layers, and how the uterine cycle can be divided into the menstrual phase, proliferative phase, and secretory phase. We also talked about the important role that progesterone and estrogen play in the cycle. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe to EKG Science so you don't miss a single lecture. And remember, subtract complexity and slow down. To study the next lecture, simply click the next video, or you can view the entire playlist. Hey, stop procrastinating!